Okay, how do I even explain this? So when I was working on my last video, my computer basically detonated out from under me. There was an issue with the graphics card. It was a whole thing. What that eventually meant is that my last video was cut a little short. And I wanted to complete it. It's a project that I cared about, so I just essentially shunted over the arguments and the conclusions from that past video into this one, which I'm just going to call a part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, it's pretty necessary to follow through on this one, so I'll leave a link in the description below. I'll also be playing the last, 30 seconds of that video just to catch everyone up as we kind of move into it. There'll be a timestamp if you want to skip past that. Alright, thanks for sticking with me. Part of the compelling tragedy of the bad dad stories that have fascinated us for the past few decades is that even to the very best practitioners of this tradition of paternal autonomy and authority, this heritage is still brutally self-immolating and isolating. And even as this heroic tradition has become more visible to us, and therefore more available for critique and satire, its grip on our imagination is so firm that it's still difficult for our media to break free of it. In the Magic storyline, Gideon best represents this tradition, and in many ways he is its most benign embodiment, but he is still a casualty of this heroic model. In his youth, Gideon aimed to confront the god Erebos alone, and his hubris resulted in the deaths of many of his friends. Because Gideon is so trapped in this logic of the exceptional individual, the only way he can find atonement for his guilt is to engage in an act of profound self-sacrifice, which arrives at the end of War of the Spark when he takes a death blow for Liliana. Joe Redman wrote an incredible article over at Hipsters of the Coast about Gideon's final moments that I absolutely encourage you to read in full. But for this conversation, I wanted to highlight a moment where Joe writes that we can mourn Gideon's loss and wonder about what might have gone differently if he didn't choose to surround himself with more pain every day. Perhaps if Gideon had realized that it was okay to hurt and possible to continue on sooner, if he had let others empathize with him, things would have ended up differently. But we also need to recognize that, as Joe writes, Gideon's choices are not a path to emulate. They are not a model for how to behave in a healthy mental and physical way. And that is the stakes of this conversation. If our heroes are the people we are asked to admire and perhaps even emulate, then we need to better articulate the consequences of pursuing these heroics. Sure, I can sit here and say I'd like to see the Magic storyline shift into a greater emphasis on this kind of maternal heroics, one based on a kind of shared vulnerability more than independence and self-determination. But if I can't prove that that would work, then it doesn't really get us anywhere. So I wanted to find an example from the superhero storytelling model that Magic clearly seems to be pursuing that demonstrates some of these qualities that I've been talking about today. And I found an example, although not exactly where I thought it would.
Things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Listen to these words. Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter.
The original Guardians of the Galaxy movie follows a group of outcasts who are the product of broken families, whether it be genocidal dads, sick moms, or the perverse experimentations of a mutations lab. Each member of the team is belligerent, combative, and driven mostly by the need for revenge or self-preservation. Initially, this means that they are openly hostile to one another and everyone else around them, which leads most people to view them in a similar light.
What a bunch of a-holes.
And this is exactly what the Guardians want. Because they are each the product of deep trauma, they believe themselves to be fundamentally broken and incapable of genuine connection. I think one of Rocket Raccoon's most celebrated lines can be read with a darker undertone when we apply this lens.
Ain't no thing like me except me.
Behind the bravado, the subtext here is that the damage Rocket has sustained has led him to believe that he is somehow other or different in an irreconcilable way from the people around him. But we know that there is still hope for these losers because each Guardian still clings to an artifact of a past life that represents a sense of belonging. For Peter Quill, that is the mixtape that embodies the spirit of his mom.
Hey, put that away. Hey, listen to me, you big blue bastard. Take those headphones off. That's mine. Those belong in Impound, that tape, and that player is mine! Hooked on a feeling. Blue Swede, 1973, that song belongs to me!
But even this memory is compromised. Quill's last moment with his mom is an instance of failed connection. Likely overwhelmed by the illness she has, a young Peter turns away when his mother reaches out to hold his hand.
Peter. Pete, come on. Take my hand.
Before he has a chance to correct himself, she dies. The plot arc of this movie involves the difficult journey these characters take to incorporate loss into the foundations of a new communion between the other members of the team. Going back to Maggie Nelson's idea of the many-gendered mothers, these characters are only capable of becoming heroes for one another and by virtue of one another. Couldn't have done it alone, and they're stronger for having done it together. And in the final confrontation, Quill's mom acts as an ecstatic matriarchal cosmology, unifying these thematic elements of loss and the bravery required to reach your hand out to admit that you need the touch of another. Even in the wake of victory after the War of the Spark, the Gatewatch stands broken, humbled, and guilty. The story moving forward will have to acknowledge the weight of memory. It will have to find novel ways to weave the character's sense of loss into new forms of connection. It will need to be willing to display vulnerability. And I think for that to happen, it will need to be a story told through mothers. Breathe, child.